The box sat on the workbench where Donal had left it exactly as he had left it, because Wren had not yet decided what to do with a dead man's tools. 14 months after the typhoid took him, the box remained in the same corner of the barn lid. Closed leather strap buckled, the way he always buckled it, left latch first, then right, then the center pin pushed down with his thumb until it clicked. She knew this because she had watched him do it 1,000 times without once thinking she was memorizing something she would need later. She found the newspaper on a Tuesday in June of 1881 when she finally opened the box. She had not opened it to grieve. Grief was a luxury the Kansas plains did not offer in June, when the wheat needed cutting and the south fence had developed a lean that would become a collapse by August if she ignored it. She opened it because the box contained the only set of chisels on the property, and she needed a chisel to repair the gate post. She unbuckled the straps in order left, right, center, and lifted the lid, and there among the chisels and the draw knife, and the two spare handles wrapped in oilcloth, was a folded square of newsprint tucked against the side wall of the box as though Donal had placed it there for safekeeping. The paper was the Nebraska Farmer March, 1879. 2 years old, nearly 3. The fold lines had darkened with oil from his hands. She opened it on the workbench and found the page he had wanted, a short article, 4 paragraphs about the building methods of the plains settlers who had learned from the Earth Lodge tradition how a man with enough patience and enough sod could construct a room that the winter could not reach. The article described thermal principles in plain language, the way packed earth held warmth, the way a stone holds the heat of afternoon sun long after the sun is gone, releasing it slowly through the cold hours, a battery of heat that cost nothing to charge. In the margin beside the third paragraph, in the small, careful handwriting that Wren had read 10,000 times on letters and ledger pages and notes left on the kitchen table, Donal had written 6 words in pencil. W, can this actually be done? She stood at the workbench for a long time. The chisel she had come for was still in the box. She took it, went out and fixed the gate post, returned the chisel, buckled the straps in order, and set the box back in its corner. Then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil and began to write down what she knew about the north wall of the barn. Wren Calloway was 35 years old in the summer of 1881, and she did not look like a woman who spent her evenings doing thermal calculations because she did not look like anything people expected. She was not large, not striking, not the kind of presence that made a room rearrange itself. Taller than average, but built lean from years of work that left no room for anything extra. Her hands were the most honest part of her, calloused across the palm in the specific pattern that came from axe handles, rough at the fingertips, from twine marked along the right thumb with a white scar from a draw knife that had slipped in the winter of 1878 when she was still learning what Kansas required of her. Her hair was dark brown, and she wore it pinned up because she had not cut it since Donal died, and she had not cut it before because he had asked her not to. Her eyes were the color of weathered slate, the kind of eyes that squinted into wind automatically, that read cloud formations the way other people read text, that had learned to assess a situation at distance before committing to a direction. She never wore anything without pockets. That was the most consistent thing about her, the detail that people who knew her mentioned when they tried to describe her to people who didn't. 4 pockets minimum, the 2 on her work apron, the one sewn into the left side of her skirt, the small one inside her coat that she had added herself with a piece of canvas and a blunt needle. The pockets held a folding rule, a stub of pencil, a small notebook with a wax cover, whatever else the day required. She did not carry things she didn't need. She did not own things she couldn't use. Donal had been the one who talked. He had been the kind of man who could turn a conversation about fence posts into something that lasted an hour and left everyone involved feeling they had learned something worth knowing. Wren was not that kind of person. She listened well, she answered questions directly, she did not explain herself unless explanation was necessary for someone else to do their part. This quality had been mistaken over the years for coldness. It was not coldness. It was efficiency of a particular kind, the efficiency of a woman who had understood early that in Ford County, Kansas in 1881, the margin between surviving a winter and not surviving one was thinner than most people wanted to believe. Donal had survived 3 winters before the typhoid found him in April of 1880. He had not been careless. He had boiled the water as they always boiled. It had done everything the same way he always did, and the typhoid had come anyway from a source they never identified. He was sick for 11 days. On the 12th day, Wren drove 55 miles to get the doctor, and on the 15th day, she drove 55 miles back alone. She did not speak much in the weeks that followed. There was too much that needed doing for speaking to be the right use of time. What she had taken from his death was not despair, though despair had been present. What she took was a lesson she already knew but had not yet learned at the level that would make her act on it. The thing that kills you is rarely the thing you were watching for. You prepared for blizzards, so you had enough firewood. You prepared for drought, so you kept the rain barrel full. But Donald had died of water, the thing you needed to live, because neither of them had prepared for the possibility that the familiar thing could become the dangerous thing. After that, she started preparing for things she hoped would never happen. The earth chamber was the most ambitious item on that list. The north wall of the barn was 30 feet long. The barn itself was a standard structure for the region, 40 feet deep, built from cottonwood logs, hauled up from the Pawnee Creek bottomlands in the summer of 1877, the year before she and Donald arrived. The previous homesteader had abandoned the claim and left the barn standing, which was one of the reasons they had chosen this particular piece of ground. The walls were sound. The roof had been reshingled twice. The floor was packed earth over limestone that surfaced naturally at the northwest corner. The north wall was where she intended to build. She spent 3 evenings in June measuring and remeasuring before she put the first number on paper. The barn's north face pressed against the prevailing winter wind, which meant that wall experienced the worst of the cold, but also meant she could berm earth against the exterior without blocking light or access to the other 3 sides. If she dug back 12 feet from that wall and 14 feet wide, setting the floor 3 feet below grade, she would have a room of 168 square feet, with the earth of Kansas itself serving as 3 of its 4 walls and its floor. The 4th wall, the one facing into the main barn, would be double-planked with a 4-inch dead air space between the layers. The ceiling would be sod bricks laid over timber joists with 2 feet of packed earth above. The calculations for heat retention she worked out over 4 evenings on the back of feed receipts, checking her arithmetic twice. Below the frost line, which in Ford County sat at roughly 32 inches, the earth maintained a temperature between 52 and 56 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of season. This was not warmth exactly, but it was the difference between a room that a small iron stove could raise to 68 degrees in an hour and a room exposed to the open air that the same stove could not warm at all. The math was simple once you understood the principle. The execution was going to take most of a summer. She told no one what she was doing. This was not deception, or rather, it was the minimum deception necessary for the project to survive long enough to prove itself. She had seen in 4 years on the Kansas plains what happened to innovations that were announced before they were proven. The community that surrounded her was not malicious, not incurious, not opposed to progress. It was simply a community shaped by hard experience, and hard experience had taught it that the gap between a good idea and a working system could be wide enough to fall into and not come back from. If she told her neighbors she was building an earth-bermed emergency shelter inside her barn, she would receive within a week the considered opinions of every person within 15 miles who had ever survived a Kansas winter. And those opinions would be delivered with the absolute certainty of people who had already paid for their knowledge and suffering. So she told them she was expanding the root cellar. This was entirely credible. Root cellars were common practical, the kind of improvement a resourceful widow would make to a property she intended to keep. The sod bricks she ordered in small quantities from the supply cooperative in Millhaven, never enough at one time to raise questions. The flat stones she hauled herself from the Pawnee Creek bed 3 miles east, a wagon load at a time over the course of 6 weeks, which was the kind of slow, persistent labor that nobody in the county found remarkable, because everyone was doing some version of it all the time. The lumber she needed for joists and the interior wall she salvaged from an abandoned claim 8 miles north, loading it herself and driving home in the dark. She dug in the evenings after field work when the air came off the plains with enough coolness to make the labor bearable. She removed the earth in buckets, 10 to 12 buckets per evening, each bucket carried out through the back of the barn and scattered across different parts of the property so that no single pile would accumulate to a size that invited questions. This took longer than she had calculated. Almost everything took longer than she had calculated. By the end of July, she revised her completion estimate from September to October. Then in August, revised it again to November, which began to feel uncomfortably close to the season she was building against. She kept a small notebook with the wax cover for measurements, material quantities, problems encountered. The problems encountered section grew faster than the others. The limestone that surfaced at the northwest corner required a different approach than she had planned. She could not dig through it with the tools she had, so she incorporated it instead using the natural stone as part of the floor rather than fighting it. This turned out to be an improvement. The thermal mass of natural limestone was better than packed earth. The floor that resulted was more level than anything she could have dug by hand. The ventilation system gave her the most trouble. She understood the principle: warm air rises, cold air settles a space with only one opening, would gradually deplete its oxygen. But translating principle into practice in a room with 2-foot sod walls required 3 attempts and the sacrifice of 6 good sod bricks before she arrived at a solution that satisfied her. 2 vents, each 4 inches square, placed near the ceiling on opposite walls, covered with sliding wood panels on the interior side. Enough airflow to keep a fire burning cleanly. Small enough that the heat loss was manageable. She tested the concept with a candle held near each vent and watched the flame behavior for 20 minutes before she was willing to call it done. Ruth Alderman appeared on a Wednesday morning in early August when Wren was mortaring stones into the floor's northeast corner, and her arrival was so typical of Ruth that Wren did not find it startling. Ruth had been homesteading 2 miles north for 22 years, which made her the oldest continuous resident of the area, and she had developed over those years the habit of appearing when something interesting was happening, as though the plains themselves had informed her. She was 64, built solid from the same work that had made Wren lean, with white hair worn in a braid, and a face that had been in Kansas sun long enough that the lines in it had lines of their own. She arrived carrying a pan of cornbread, which was her standard admission price to other people's business. She set the cornbread on the edge of the barn entrance, came inside, looked at the partially completed chamber for a long time without speaking. Then she asked to see the plans. Wren showed her the notebook. Ruth studied the pages with the focused silence of a woman who had spent decades solving problems that did not come with instructions. She asked 2 questions: the depth of the frost line. Wren was using in her calculations the species of timber in the ceiling joists. She pointed at the northwest corner of the ceiling plan where the 2 ventilation ducts were drawn. More air movement there, her voice carrying the authority of direct experience rather than theory. Wren started to explain the reasoning behind the placement. Ruth cut her off, not unkindly. I spent 3 days in my root cellar in the winter of 1867. The northwest corner is where the air stops moving. I do not know the engineering reason. I know what the candle did. Wren moved the northwest vent placement 3 feet to the east on the plan. Ruth ate her cornbread standing up, looking at the stone floor. She did not ask why Wren was building the thing, which was either because she had already understood or because she believed that a woman who had put this much work into a structure had earned the right to her own reasons. She left without making recommendations about whether Wren should or shouldn't proceed. This was one of the things Wren valued most about Ruth Alderman. The woman understood the difference between giving counsel and giving permission. Elias Pruitt arrived in the 3rd week of September, which was earlier than Wren had expected, and later than she should have anticipated. He was 55, thick through the chest and shoulders from years of work that had followed years of soldiering, with iron gray hair cut short in the way of men who had spent time in the Army and never quite unlearned its preferences. He had served as a quartermaster for the Union, which meant he had spent 4 years thinking about supplies, logistics, the 1,000 ways that systems failed when you needed them most. And he had brought that habit of mind to Ford County when he homesteaded in 1872. He had kept his family alive through 3 hard winters on the strength of careful preparation and the absolute refusal to trust anything he had not personally tested. And this had given him a confidence in his own judgment that was not arrogance exactly, but was close enough to arrogance that the distinction required knowing him well to see. He had heard about the sod bricks from a man at the cooperative, a detail Wren had not anticipated because she had not considered that the pattern of her purchases might be visible across multiple transactions to a man who was paying attention. She filed this observation in the notebook section she had not written yet, the one about what she had gotten wrong. He stood in the chamber and looked at everything without touching anything. The stone floor, the sod walls now 3 feet thick and mortared solid, the double plank interior wall with its dead air gap, the small iron stove with the flue running up through the ceiling and joining the barn's main chimney stack, The two ventilation panels with their sliding covers, the shelves along the east wall not yet stocked, the ceiling joists with their 2 feet of packed earth pressing down on them. He took his time. She gave him time. The joists, he said finally. What's the load rating? She told him the timber species, the dimensions, the span, the calculated load including the earth above. He worked the numbers in his head, which she could see him doing. He arrived at the same answer she had. The flue junction, he said. If the main chimney develops a crack, secondary draw from the east vent, she answered. Enough to keep the stove burning if I reduce the fuel load by half. He looked at the east vent, looked at the stove, looked at the flue junction where it met the main chimney. He was checking her work, which was his right and was not offensive, though she felt the particular quality of attention required to not make it offensive. He was not wrong to check. She had checked herself 4 times. Too many dependencies, he said. The words came out with the flat certainty of a man who had seen supply chains fail in the field, who had watched the elaborate plan collapse at the moment the third thing in a sequence of necessary things didn't arrive. You've built a system where 7 components have to function simultaneously. In a standard barn, if the wall cracks, you patch the wall. In this, if the flue junction fails at 40 below, what's your sequence? She walked him through it. Seal the flue damper switch to the secondary draw, reduce fuel use, body heat from occupants as supplemental source monitor with candle at each vent. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. A man in my unit at Chancellorsville died in a redoubt, he said. Well-built, well-supplied, good position. One support beam gave way. The weight shifted. Nobody had planned for the weight shift. He looked at the ceiling joists. I'm not saying this is the same situation. I'm saying that the plan for what happens when one thing fails is more important than the plan for when everything works. She wrote down everything he had said. Not because he was right, she believed he was partly wrong that his framework for evaluating risk was built on military logistics rather than structural engineering, that the dependencies he was counting were not as fragile as he thought. But because the act of writing forced her to examine each point independently, and if he was even 20% right about any of it, she needed to know which 20%. She repaired 2 things after he left. She added a second support to the northwest ceiling joist and widened the secondary vent opening by 1 inch. These were small changes. They cost her 2 hours and 11 cents of additional material. She made them because Elias Pruitt had been right about the northwest joist, even if he hadn't known specifically what he was right about. May Kowalski came in October with the manner of a general conducting an inspection, which was not an affectation. It was what inspecting something looked like when the person doing it had genuinely fought for everything she owned and understood exactly what was at stake when a structure failed in winter. She was 51, a widow for 8 years, farming land she had broken herself in 1874. She had survived the blizzard of 1873, the one that killed 70 people across Kansas, by sheltering in a standard cattle barn for 3 days with 2 dairy cows and a Presbyterian minister who had been traveling through and gotten caught. She never talked about those 3 days in much detail, but the effects were visible in the way she evaluated enclosed spaces with the specific attention of someone who had spent 72 hours in one calculating air quality and light, and the exact temperature at which a person's thinking began to get unreliable. She walked the chamber's perimeter twice. She tested each wall with the heel of her hand pressing steadily, checking for movement. She stood in the center and looked at the ceiling, then at the floor, then at the single interior wall that separated the chamber from the main barn. A man I knew in 73, she said. He was in a grain storage building, 3 other people with him. Better insulated than a barn, plenty of food, fire going. She pressed the sole of her boot against the stone floor, testing its solidity. On the second night, he pushed through the door. Outside temperature was 38 below. They found him 14 feet from the door. She looked at Wren directly. He was not stupid. He was not unprepared. He lost his mind from the darkness in the closed space, and no amount of food and fire mattered after that. Wren did not have an immediate answer for this, which was the right response. She thought about it overnight. The problem May was describing was real and was not addressed anywhere in her plans, because she had been thinking about temperature and air quality and structural integrity, which were the engineering problems, and had not been thinking about the psychological architecture of a space where people might spend days without natural light. She added two things the following week. 4 hooks along the south wall for hanging the 2 oil lanterns she planned to stock positioned so their light would reflect off the interior plank wall and create the impression of more illumination than the lanterns alone produced. A small viewing slot cut into the interior wall at eye height, 4 inches by 8 inches, with a sliding cover enough to see into the main barn, enough to break the sensation of being completely sealed in, enough that a person standing in the chamber could look through and see the barn door and the rectangle of light beneath it, and know that the outside world still existed. This last addition cost her a Sunday afternoon and one good saw blade. She believed it might be the most important thing she had built. May came back 3 weeks later alone on a morning when Wren was cutting firewood on the far side of the barn. She did not announce herself. Wren found the evidence later. The viewing slot had been opened and closed. One of the lantern hooks had been tested with weight. She could see the slight impression in the soft wood where a hand had pulled down on it. May had returned to look at the changes without being asked, without anyone watching, without making it into anything that required acknowledgement. Wren did not mention it. Neither did May. But something shifted between them after that, some small degree of mutual respect that had not quite existed before, the kind that only develops between people who have both had the experience of being wrong about something important. Cal Maddox came in November, the first week when the temperature had already dropped enough that the grass on the south slope had gone brown and stiff. He was 28 years old and had been born in Kansas Territory in 1854, the year before it was organized, and this gave him a relationship to the land that was different from anyone else Wren knew. He had not arrived here and learned it. He had come into consciousness already knowing it, the way a person knows the smell of their own kitchen, not as information, but as foundation. He worked as a ranch hand on the Tillman operation 7 miles east, but he covered the county the way people cover ground. They feel responsible for checking on isolated homesteads. In the same way he checked water sources and fence lines as a matter of course, rather than charity. He had a stillness to him that was not passivity, more like the stillness of a man who had learned that the plains rewarded observation over reaction, that the second look was usually more valuable than the first move. He sat on an upturned bucket in the chamber's entrance and looked at everything from that single position. He did not walk the perimeter. He did not press the walls. He studied the layout, the stove position, the ventilation, the ceiling load, the viewing slot, the lantern hooks, the shelving, all of it from one spot, turning his head slowly the way he probably looked at the sky when he was reading weather. "It's well built," he said. The acknowledgement cost him nothing and meant something because he was not the kind of man who offered it otherwise. "The craftsmanship is solid. The thinking is solid." He was quiet for a moment. "But here's what I keep coming back to." She waited. "Everything out here that works, works because you can see it failing before it fails all the way. A fence post starts to lean. A well rope starts to fray. You see it, you fix it, you move on." He looked at the ceiling, at the 2 feet of earth above the joists. "This, if something goes wrong in there during a 3-day blow at 40 below, what's your move? You can't patch the wall from inside. You can't adjust the flue from inside once the drift closes over the barn door. You've built a room that cannot be repaired from within it." The observation landed differently than Elias's concerns had landed, because Elias had been evaluating her system against military logistics, and Cal was evaluating it against the specific physics of the Kansas plains in winter. He was not wrong. He was describing a real constraint. A system that could not be modified under the conditions it was designed for was a system that required perfection on the first build, and Wren knew better than anyone that there was no such thing. She spent 2 weeks with this problem. The solution she arrived at was not a perfect answer, but it was an honest one. She could not make the chamber repairable from inside under blizzard conditions, so she had to make it robust enough that repair under those conditions would not be necessary. This meant going back through every component and asking a harder question than she had been asking. Not will this work, but what is the failure mode? How likely is that failure? What does it cost? She reinforced the ceiling joists a second time. She doubled the mortar on the 3 sod walls. She added a third ventilation option, a small sliding panel near the floor on the east wall, 2 inches by 4 inches, that could be opened from inside to provide emergency airflow if both upper vents were somehow blocked. Then she thought about what Cal had said for another week, and she decided to test the system the only way it could be tested. Elias Pruitt came back in the second week of October 1882, 3 weeks before the storm, and the difference from his first visit was in his face before he had said anything. In September of the previous year, he had come with the professional skepticism of a man evaluating a project. He came now with something heavier than skepticism, the specific weight of a person carrying information they have not yet decided how to deliver. He put an envelope on the workbench. Inside was a letter from his brother who farmed in Gage County, Nebraska. The letter described a family name not given who had built an earth chamber the previous winter, their own design a serious attempt by serious people who had read about the method and built carefully. The flue had been positioned wrong. Not obviously wrong in a way that only became apparent under specific wind conditions that did not occur until the second day of occupancy. The carbon monoxide had built gradually. By the time anyone understood what was happening, there was no time left to act. 4 people. A couple, their grown son, a neighbor who had come for shelter. She read the letter twice. "You could be wrong," Elias said. He was not saying it to wound her. He was saying it the way a man who cared about the outcome said things when he believed the outcome was still changeable. If you're wrong, you won't know you're wrong until you're inside it with no way out. She looked at the letter for a moment longer. Then she looked up. Where was the flue positioned in their design? He didn't know. The letter didn't say. She went to the chamber. She opened it, pointed at her flue, the position relative to the stove, the angle of the first elbow, the junction with the main chimney stack, the clearance from the nearest sod wall. She explained in the flat technical language she used when she was thinking rather than performing why the position mattered, what it did to the combustion draw, how a flue position 6 inches differently would have created the condition the letter described, and why her position did not create that condition. Elias listened. He was a man who could evaluate technical arguments, who had spent his quartermaster years running calculations on load and supply and the physics of moving things through difficult terrain. He followed what she was saying. "You could still be wrong," he said when she finished. Not stubbornly, with the particular honesty of a man who understood that understanding an argument and knowing the argument was correct were 2 different things. "Yes," she said. He took the letter back and left. She stood in the chamber entrance after he was gone, one hand on the doorframe, looking at the stove, and the flue, and the ventilation slots, and the shelves with their provisions stacked in the specific order she had developed over 16 months of refinement. And she asked herself the question she always asked when the doubt came, not am I right, but have I done everything I can do to find out if I'm wrong? On a Thursday night in the 3rd week of October, when the temperature outside had dropped to 28 degrees and there was no moon, Wren pulled on her heaviest wool coat, tied her fur-lined cap down over her ears, pulled her leather work gloves on, lit the small iron stove in the chamber, set 3 candles on the center shelf, and pulled the heavy plank door closed behind her. She had told no one she was doing this. Ruth Alderman knew about the chamber. Ruth would not know to look for her before morning. She sat on the floor with her back against the south wall and watched the candles. This was the entirety of the test. If the ventilation was functioning correctly, the candles would burn without flickering irregularly, without yellowing at the tip, without the particular kind of dimming that indicated depleted oxygen. She had read about this in a pamphlet on mine safety borrowed from the Ford County Land Office. The candles burned steadily. She watched them for 2 hours, then 3, then 4. The temperature in the chamber climbed from 54 to 68 degrees, exactly what her calculations had predicted. At 68 degrees, the stove's draw stabilized, and the temperature held, which meant the flue was functioning at the correct draft ratio. She noted the fuel consumption just over 3 pounds of wood per hour at this temperature differential. At 4 in the morning, she opened the chamber door and went outside to check the exterior. The dew on the grass was frozen. The stars were the kind of hard and clear that only happened when the air had no moisture in it. The temperature outside had dropped further while she was inside. She estimated somewhere around 18 degrees. She walked around the perimeter of the barn, checking the exterior of the north wall, the chimney cap, the exterior flue opening. Everything was as she had left it. Then she saw the hoof prints. They came from the east along the track that served as the road to her property, and they circled the front of the barn before returning along the same track. The horse had stopped twice near the main barn door. She could see the displacement in the frost where it had stood. Someone had ridden out to her property in the middle of the night and had found the barn dark and the house dark, and no sign of anyone home. They had circled. They had left. She stood in the cold and looked at the hoof prints for a long time. She did not recognize the shoe pattern specifically, but the stride length suggested a horse of medium build, the kind common to the county. She added an entry to the notebook, ventilation adequate. Heat retention confirmed. Fuel consumption 3.1 pounds per hour at 68 degrees internal, 18 degrees external. Candles stable throughout. Identify visitor. The last item she underlined once. She saw Lena Kowalski at the Saturday market in Millhaven in the third week of August, which was later than she usually went, but the August had been hot enough to rearrange her schedule. Lena was May's daughter-in-law, 24 years old, married 2 years. She was 5 months along, which showed, and she was coughing not the single cough of a tickle or the brief bout that went with summer dust, but the sustained productive cough that came from something in the lungs that should not be there, pressing her hand flat against her sternum between bouts as though she could hold it down by pressure alone. Wren watched her from across the market square for 2 minutes doing the arithmetic she had not intended to do and could not stop herself from doing once she started. 5 months in August meant 8 months in November. A woman in her 8th month carrying something in her lungs that was making her cough like that in a blizzard. She finished her market business in Millhaven, drove home, went directly to the chamber. She added to the shelves a length of clean muslin cut in 4-inch strips, boiled and dried. 2 cones of refined salt. A stoppered bottle of clean water kept separate from the general supply. A length of wax cord. A small pair of scissors from her sewing kit, the sharp ones. She did not tell anyone she had made these additions. She buckled the chamber door closed and went back to the barn work that was waiting for her. The preparation she had just made was not a prediction. It was an acknowledgement that possibility and probability were different things, and that confusing them was how people died when the worst arrived. Josiah Reed had been delivering mail in Ford County for 19 years, which meant he had ridden every road in the county in every season, which meant he understood weather the way a man understands something that has tried to kill him on multiple occasions. He was not a scientist. He did not use words like barometric pressure in ordinary conversation. But he had a brass aneroid barometer mounted on a wooden board above his kitchen table, and he read it every morning before he read anything else. And on the morning of November 11th, 1882, the needle had dropped so far so fast that he had stood in front of it for 3 full minutes before he accepted what it was telling him. He arrived at Wren's gate at 7 in the morning because he was not delivering mail. His face had the particular quality of a man who has spent years bringing news to isolated homesteads and has learned to carry bad news without flinching, because flinching helps no one. He said the barometer had moved faster in the past 6 hours than he had seen it move in 19 years of watching it. He said the sky to the northwest had taken on the color of iron left in standing water, not gray, not green, not quite either, but the specific shade that old-timers in the county called the killing color, because they had seen it before the storms that left cattle frozen upright in open fields. Year of 73. He said the words carrying the compressed weight of specific knowledge. I was 28. I had not been here long enough yet to understand what that sky meant. He did not need to finish the sentence. 70 people had died in Kansas in the blizzard of 1873. May Kowalski had survived it by 36 hours in a cattle barn. A man whose name Josiah still knew had been found 6 days after the storm ended, frozen solid in his own kitchen doorway, his hand still on the latch. This sky is worse than 73 sky was. That is my assessment after 19 years. I have no instruments to prove it. I have the 19 years. Wren looked northwest for a long moment. The horizon had that quality she had learned to read in 4 years on the plains, where the sky did not just darken, but seemed to compress to lower itself toward the earth, as though the atmosphere itself were gathering for impact. The wind was from the north, which in Ford County in November was not wind so much as announcement, the leading edge of something that had come 1,000 miles across open ground without anything to slow it. She thanked Josiah. He told her May Kowalski had left for Millhaven at first light to bring back goods before the storm, which meant May was on the open road between town and her homestead. He had passed her wagon 3 miles out and told her to turn back. May had told him she knew her own business. Josiah rode on to warn the next homestead. Wren went to work. She had a sequence. She had built the sequence over 4 years of Kansas winters, refined it after Donald died when the sequence became hers alone, to execute refined it further during the past 14 months, when she had been thinking about what a sequence that accounted for the worst-case scenario looked like. The two draft horses came in without resistance. They could read the sky as well as Josiah could. The three dairy cows were harder the way cows were always harder, requiring the specific combination of patience and pressure that Wren had learned from watching Donal and then learning again by herself after he was gone. She had them all in their stalls by 9:30, which left the barn's main space clear for what was coming. Then the chamber. She opened it, lit the small iron stove with wood she had staged near the entrance the previous week, not because she had known the storm was coming on this specific day, but because she had known the storm was coming on some day, which was the entirety of the principle she had built her preparations on. The stove needed 40 minutes to begin warming the stone floor, and the stone floor needed another 2 hours to reach the temperature at which it would begin radiating heat back into the room, rather than absorbing it. She had learned this from her October night test. She lit the stove at 9:45. She checked the provisions while the stove worked. Salt pork wheat flour, cornmeal in sealed tins, dried apples, preserved vegetables from the summer garden. Smoked venison from a deer Cal Maddox had brought by in September. Without explanation, 60 pounds of coffee. Water, 3 ceramic jugs stoppered with wax. Medical supplies on the lower shelf, willow bark, camphor oil, clean cloth in 4-inch strips. The small, sharp scissors, the wax cord, the refined salt. Lamp oil, 4 gallons. 6 spare wicks. Matches in 3 separate waterproof tins distributed across different shelves so that one accident could not eliminate all ignition sources. She counted the blankets, 11. She had 11 blankets in the chamber and 4 more in the house that she would bring if time allowed. The temperature had dropped 14 degrees in the 2 hours since Josiah's visit. She felt this not on a thermometer, but on the exposed skin of her wrists, where her coat sleeves ended, where the cold no longer bit in the ordinary winter way, but pressed a sustained, purposeful pressure that communicated intent rather than condition. The sky to the northwest had moved closer. The distance between her and the storm's front edge was not the same distance it had been 2 hours ago. She was back in the barn by 11:30 with the house blankets, the 2 remaining oil lamps, the tin of matches from the kitchen shelf. She set these inside the chamber, added 2 more logs to the stove, checked the flue draft with a lit candle held near the damper. The flame pulled cleanly. The temperature inside the chamber had reached 61 degrees. At 12:15, the first gust hit the barn. It was not a wind gust in the familiar sense. It was a displacement event, the leading edge of the system arriving with enough force to move the entire barn structure a fraction of an inch on its foundation, an involuntary shift that Wren felt through the soles of her boots on the packed earth floor. The sound that came with it was not the whistle or the howl she knew from ordinary winter storms. It was a sustained bass note, more vibration than sound, the kind of thing you felt in your chest cavity rather than heard with your ears. She pulled the rope from its hook on the center post. The rope was 300 yards of half-inch hemp she had purchased at the Millhaven Cooperative in September, paying for it with money she had allocated specifically for this purpose, itemized in her ledger under the heading Emergency Equipment. She had tested its strength by hanging her full body weight from the hook over the barn door. It had held without creaking. She tied one end to the base of the center post, a cottonwood log 12 inches in diameter, set 4 feet into the ground. In 1877, the same post she had verified last spring was still solid at the base by probing with an iron rod. She coiled the remaining rope over her left shoulder, looped the other end around her waist twice, tied it with the knot Donal had taught her the first winter, the one that could be loosened with one pull of the tail but would not slip under load. She pulled her fur-lined cap lower over her ears, checked that her leather gloves were secure at the wrists, and opened the barn door. The wind took it immediately, slamming it against the exterior wall with a force that would have splintered an ordinary door. She braced her body in the opening against the pressure, which was not like leaning into ordinary wind, but like leaning into something with the consistency of moving water, a continuous lateral force, rather than a series of gusts. The temperature outside hit her exposed cheeks like a held blade. The visibility was 6 feet, perhaps 8. Beyond 8 feet, the air was white. She went out. The rope technique was simple in principle and required complete attention in practice. She moved by feel, keeping the rope behind her so it ran back toward the barn in a straight line, which meant she was always moving directly away from her anchor point. She could not see the ground clearly, which meant she navigated by the angle of the slope she knew was there, the slight rise going east toward the Pruitt homestead, and by the wind direction against her body, which was the most consistent compass available in a blizzard, because the wind in a blue norther came from one direction and did not vary. She found the Pruitt property not by sight but by her boot catching the low step of their porch, which she had climbed a dozen times. The sound inside the structure was wrong, the particular silence that open sky makes when a roof has been partially removed. She put her shoulder against the door. Elias was on his feet. His wife, Eleanor, braced against the interior wall with both arms around the two children, ages 7 and 9. His mother-in-law, Ida, seated on the floor in the corner with a blanket around her shoulders, and the characteristic stillness of a woman who was either very calm or very sick. And at 74 years old, in a partially exposed structure at 15 below zero, was likely some of both. A section of the roof on the east side had lifted and peeled back 6 feet from the eave, and through the gap, the storm was driving snow horizontally, and the interior of the space Elias Pruitt had built and maintained for 10 years had in the past 45 minutes become as hostile to life as the open plains. Wren held up the rope. Elias understood immediately the man had spent 4 years supplying an army and knew the value of a line in confusion. She organized them by vulnerability. Ida first supported between Eleanor and Elias, then the two children each holding a section of rope, then Eleanor, then Elias, at the end, where his weight could anchor against a stumble. Wren led, feeling the rope play out behind her, keeping the angle consistent, trusting the slope of the ground and the wind on her left cheek. The return took 11 minutes. She counted her steps, which was the only reliable measurement available in white blindness. She did not look back. Looking back would have told her nothing useful and would have taken her attention from the ground in front of her feet, which was the only information that mattered. When her right hand touched the barn door, she let out a breath she had not known she was holding. Elias came through last and pulled the door behind him. The barn's main interior dropped from white noise to the relative quiet of a space with 4 solid walls, and in that relative quiet, the difference between outside and inside was the difference between certain death and possible survival. Eleanor was holding both children against her body. Ida's lips had gone a grayish color that was not hypothermia yet, but was the direction of hypothermia. Elias stood with his back against the closed door and looked at Wren with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the evaluating attention of his visits to the chamber, but something older and simpler. The look of a man who has been in the field long enough to know when someone else's decision just saved his life. He said nothing. She turned to assess the barn's main temperature, which had already dropped to around 10 below despite the livestock, which was dropping still, which was going to become unsurvivable within the hour for children and a woman in the early stages of hypothermia. May Kowalski arrived 40 minutes later. She came through the barn door with Lena behind her, and Lena's condition had not improved since August. She was 8 months along. Now her face the color of tallow, her breathing carrying the wet quality that the cough in August had predicted. May's coat was stiff with ice on the exterior. She had walked the last mile and a half after her horse refused to go further, which Wren's arithmetic told her meant May Kowalski had made that decision in air that was now somewhere around 20 below zero without a windbreak. She had not done it because she was unafraid. She had done it because Lena was with her and there was no alternative. Ruth Alderman came alone, her right hand wrapped in a strip of cloth over a cut from the iron latch on her gate, which had frozen shut and split the skin across her palm when she forced it. She had walked 2 miles from her homestead. She looked at the cut with the detached assessment of a woman who had treated her own injuries many times, decided it required cleaning and pressure, and looked around the barn for material to use. Cal Maddox arrived with the Garrett family, Owen, 29 years old, his wife Della, 24, their son Tommy, 4 years old, wearing a coat size for a child, a year younger, already soaked through on the shoulders from the transit across open ground. Their homestead was 3 months old. Their walls were the first attempt walls of people who had not yet learned what Ford County walls needed to be, and the storm had found every gap in them. Josiah Reed came last of the people who came arriving on foot after his horse went down in a drift 200 yards out. He had half carried himself along his own fence line by feel, which was the technique of a man who had 19 years of reasons to install fence lines where they would be useful in exactly this situation. Wren counted them, 17 people in the main barn. The temperature in the main barn had dropped to 4 below zero. The 3 dairy cows were pressed together in the corner of their stall. Frost had formed on the interior face of the east wall. The children's breath came in thick clouds that did not fully dissipate before the next breath added to them. 4 below inside. The gap between inside and outside was closing in the wrong direction. She went to the north wall. She pulled the hay bales aside, 2 stacked, then 2 more, revealing the plank door with its iron latch that she had installed and tested and opened 100 times in the past 14 months alone. She lifted the latch. She pulled the door open. The air that came out was the temperature of a spring afternoon, and it hit the people standing in the barn the way spring hits after a long winter. Not as a comfortable thing, but as a shock. The shock of warmth that the body had forgotten was possible. She stood in the doorway of the chamber she had spent 14 months building alone, for reasons she had not explained to anyone in front of 17 people, who had each, at various times over the past year, offered their considered assessment of why she should not be building it. And she said, "Come in." The chamber's temperature had reached 64 degrees. The stone floor radiated steady warmth at shin height. The stove was burning cleanly, its flue drawing without backdraft. The sod walls on 3 sides absorbed the light from the 2 oil lamps and returned it as a diffuse amber glow that made the space feel larger than its dimensions. The shelves along the east wall held their provisions in the specific order she had established, which was the order of most likely need. Elias Pruitt was the first one through the door. He did not hesitate. He brought Ida by the arm, got her seated against the south wall, where the stove's heat gathered, then stood in the center of the chamber, and looked at everything with the careful calibrating attention of a man who had spent 4 years evaluating spaces in terms of what they could sustain. He looked at the ceiling joists, the flue junction, the ventilation panels, the viewing slot in the interior wall which showed a narrow rectangle of the barn beyond, the provisions on the shelves. He had looked at all of these things before 14 months ago when he had told Wren this system had too many dependencies. He did not say anything about that. He began helping move people into position by vulnerability. Getting 17 people into a space designed for 6 required a kind of spatial reasoning that Wren performed automatically, having thought about it over the preceding months as part of the preparation she had done for scenarios she hoped would never occur. Most vulnerable nearest the stove, and lowest to the floor where the warmth was most consistent. Children in the center, where adult bodies on all sides provided buffer. Healthy adults around the perimeter, rotating position every hour so that the person with their back against the cold north wall was not the same person for more than 60 minutes at a stretch. Tommy Garrett had stopped crying somewhere between his family's homestead and the barn's main interior, which was the kind of silence in a child that adults who knew children recognized as a worse sign than crying. He sat between his parents with his soaked coat removed, wrapped in 2 of Wren's blankets, his eyes tracking the oil lamp flame with the fixed attention of something seeking a fixed point in a disordered world. Elias saw this. He crossed the chamber in 3 steps, lowered himself to the floor in front of Tommy, positioned himself so they were at the same eye level. His voice carried the specific register of a man who understood the difference between talking to a frightened child and talking at one. "I need a person to watch this lamp. The flame has to stay this height. If it goes lower, that means something's wrong. If it goes higher, that means something's wrong. Can you do that job?" Tommy looked at the lamp, looked at Elias. The calculation happening behind the child's eyes was visible, the shift from passive fear to active purpose, which was its own kind of rescue. He nodded. Elias positioned the lamp on a crate at Tommy's eye height, close enough for him to monitor, far enough to be safe, and returned to his position along the perimeter wall. Owen Garrett, watching from 2 feet away, closed his eyes for a moment. The thing he was feeling was not expressible, but it was visible. The temperature outside hit 37 below zero at some point in the late afternoon. Josiah estimated this from the behavior of the water in the small tin cup he had set near the barn door's base, before coming into the chamber, which had frozen solid in less than 20 minutes. His pocket anemometer showed sustained winds of 63 miles per hour, with gusts he estimated at 78 or higher. The barn's main space was audible through the viewing slot, the sound of the storm working on the structure, finding the gaps in the wall, chinking, driving ice crystals through every imperfect seal. The temperature in the main barn was dropping below -10. Inside the chamber, the temperature had stabilized at 69 degrees. Wren managed the stove with the precision she had calibrated during her October test fuel load draft adjustment. The small incremental changes that kept the output steady rather than cycling between too hot and too cold. She checked the ventilation candle every 4 hours, the one she kept on the center shelf specifically for this purpose, positioned where the airflow pattern would affect it first if the oxygen balance shifted. The flame burned clear. Ruth Alderman used the camphor oil and clean cloth strips on Ida's chest, which was producing the wet sound that Wren recognized from difficult winters past. Ruth worked with the competence of a woman who had been the nearest thing to a medical practitioner in this corner of Ford County for 2 decades without drama, without reassurance she couldn't honestly give. She elevated Ida's upper body with rolled blankets and stayed within reach. May Kowalski sat with her back against the east wall, Lena's head on her lap. Lena was sleeping in the irregular, interrupted way of someone whose breathing required effort even in rest. May did not sleep. She watched her daughter-in-law breathe with the concentrated watchfulness of a woman who had already decided that whatever needed doing, she would do it, and was simply waiting to find out what that would be. At some point in the evening, Cal Maddox appeared at Wren's elbow. He had been quiet since arriving, doing whatever needed doing without being asked. He stood beside her near the stove and looked at the provisions on the shelves for a moment. His voice was quiet, directed at her rather than the room. "You moved the vent placement from the original position." She understood what he was asking. He had seen the original position during his November visit, and he could see the current position, now the difference not large, but visible to a man who had looked carefully. "Northwest corner," she said. "Ruth told me the air stops moving there." Cal looked at the northwest vent, looked at the candle on the center shelf burning straight, looked back at the vent. He nodded once slowly, the nod of a man revising a prior assessment, which was one of the more valuable things a person could do and one of the rarer ones. The second crisis arrived at 2 in the morning, which was the hour when human resistance to difficulty reaches its lowest point. Wren was feeding the stove its third load of the night when she heard the change in Lena's breathing, not louder but different. A shift in rhythm, the specific alteration that had nothing to do with sleep. She crossed the chamber in 4 steps. Lena's eyes were open. May's hand was already on her daughter-in-law's shoulder, her face in the lamplight, carrying the absolute stillness of a woman who had run out of the option of hoping it was something else. Ruth was already moving from Ida's side. The contractions had been present for an hour, Lena said, keeping her voice low, her hand flat on her abdomen. She had not said anything because she had not been certain, because she had not wanted to be certain, because certainty meant that this was happening here in this place 4 weeks before it was supposed to happen. Wren made space without being asked by anyone to make it. She moved people by touch and gesture, creating a zone of privacy that was not really private in a room with 16 other people, but was the best approximation of it that the space allowed. Ruth took the near position. May took her daughter-in-law's hand. Wren got the muslin strips from the shelf, the scissors, the salt, the clean water, the materials she had added to this chamber on a Saturday in August, standing in a market square watching a woman cough doing arithmetic she had not asked to do. She had not known this would happen. She had known it might. That was the distinction. Not prediction, but preparation. Not certainty, but the decision to act on possibility before possibility became emergency. The difference between those two things was exactly the width of the chamber floor, 12 feet, the distance between the shelf where those materials waited for this moment and the woman who needed them now. The birth took 4 hours. Ruth led with the steady competence that Wren had seen her apply to every difficult thing over 4 years of neighboring, moving through each stage with the focus of a woman who understood that her emotional state was the room's emotional state, which meant her emotional state had to be calm. Wren assisted. May held her daughter-in-law's hand with a grip that did not loosen once in 4 hours. At 6 in the morning, with the storm still screaming at the exterior of the barn, at sustained winds of 63 miles per hour, and gusts beyond that with the temperature outside at 42 below zero, and the temperature inside the chamber at 67 degrees, a child was born. He was small, he was 4 weeks early. He breathed. The sound he made was thin preliminary, the sound of something testing. Whether sound was viable in this new world he had arrived in, but it was sound, it was breath, it was the specific announcement that the chamber fell silent, to hear all 16 people pulling into the same stillness. At the same moment, the crying stopped. The shifting stopped. Even Tommy lifted his eyes from the lamp. May Kowalski made a sound she would never be able to describe. She turned her face toward the south wall away from the lamplight, and her shoulders moved with something that had no ordinary name. Wren wrapped the child in the muslin she had cut in August. She had not known she was cutting it for him. She had cut it for whoever was going to need it, and he was whoever that was. The storm outside continued at full force. The stone floor beneath her knees was warm. The stove burned its steady 8 pounds per day. The ventilation candle on the center shelf burned clear. She had built this room to keep people alive. It was keeping them alive. The silence came before the light. At some point in the early hours of the third day, the sound that had been the storm's defining characteristic, that sustained bass vibration more felt than heard, that had pressed against the chamber walls for 43 hours, like something trying to find the weakness in them, simply stopped. Not faded. Stopped. The way a machine stops when someone pulls the power with an abruptness that was more alarming than reassuring, because the ears and the body had calibrated themselves to the presence of the sound and now had nothing to calibrate against. Wren was awake when it happened. She had been awake for most of the third night, rotating through the management tasks. The chamber required fuel load every 3 hours, ventilation candle check every 4, water redistribution from the large jugs to the smaller cups that people could hold with both hands for warmth. She was at the stove when the sound stopped, and she held still for a full minute before she allowed herself to believe the interpretation her senses were offering. Around her, people felt it in their sleep. She could see the shift move through the room, the restless turning that meant the body's defensive alertness was releasing its grip, shoulders dropping the tight curl that conserved heat, loosening by degrees. Tommy Garrett had fallen asleep with both hands still extended toward the lamp he had been assigned to monitor, and in the new silence, his breathing was the clearest sound in the room, slow and regular, the breathing of a child who had discharged his duty. The child Lena had delivered 6 hours earlier lay on her chest wrapped in muslin, both of them sleeping with the particular concentration of the newly exhausted. May sat beside them, her back against the east wall. She had not slept. The quality of her wakefulness had changed. It was no longer the vigilance of someone waiting for the next crisis, but something without an ordinary name. The watchfulness of a person witnessing something they understand they will carry for the rest of their lives. Ruth Alderman caught Wren's eye across the room. The look between them required no translation. The storm was over, the work was not. They dug out by stages, which was the only way to do it when you did not know what was on the other side of a door. Cal Maddox took the first shift, working from inside the barn's main entrance with a flat spade he had found hanging on the center post. The drift against the exterior of the barn door was significant. She could hear it in the resistance. When he first tried to push the door, the muffled quality of the sound, when he struck the spade against the snow's compacted face. He cleared a foot at a time, moving the excavated snow to the side rather than forward, keeping the workspace organized so that progress did not undermine itself. Josiah took the second shift. His hands were compromised. 2 fingers on his left hand had gone white during his fence line transit the previous day, and Ruth had worked on them through the night with warmth and pressure, but they were still not fully functional. He compensated by using the spade one-handed where he could, bracing the handle against his forearm when two-hand leverage was required. He did not mention the hands. He dug. Wren took the third shift. She knew what was outside this barn in every direction, knew the grade of the ground, knew where the drifts would consolidate, based on 4 years of observing how the wind came off the plains in a hard north blow. She dug at the angle that would bring them out on the south side of the drift space, rather than over its top, which would have required more elevation gain and risk collapse. The difference was 11 minutes of digging versus 40. When daylight came through the hole, she had created not the diffuse gray of a cloud-filtered morning, but actual light, direct and crystalline and painfully blue. She heard something move behind her in the barn's main space. She looked back. Elias Pruitt was standing 6 feet away, watching the light come through, and his face was doing something she had not seen it do in any of the contexts she had known him in. It was not sentiment exactly. It was closer to the expression of a man who has completed a long march and has arrived at a place he was not certain he would reach, and who is doing the arithmetic of what the arrival means. She widened the opening. When it was large enough for a person to step through without ducking, she went out first. The world outside the barn was not the world that had existed on the morning of November 11th. The temperature was still 19 below zero, which her exposed cheeks registered immediately as the sustained pressure of serious cold. But the sky above her was the specific blue of a Kansas winter morning, After a major storm, the blue that appeared when every particle of atmospheric moisture had been either frozen or blown south. A blue so clear and deep it looked less like sky than like the inside of something vast looking back. The snow had reorganized the landscape. Drifts of 17 and 18 feet on the north and east sides of the barn, sculpted by the wind into shapes resembling frozen ocean swells, each one with a sharp crest and a long windward face, packed so solid you could have walked across the top without breaking through. The chicken coop was gone, not damaged, gone, buried under a drift that had consumed the structure the way a wave consumes a rock. The wagon Josiah had left in the yard was visible only as a slight asymmetry in one drift's profile. The south fence along the road was standing. She had rebuilt that fence in the spring with extra post depth and diagonal bracing, and it was standing in 19 below air on the morning after the worst storm Ford County had experienced in at least a decade. She found the horse before anyone else came outside. It was 150 yards from the gate on the east side of the property, lying on its side. In a shallow depression, the wind had cleared enough to make the shape visible. A bay horse, medium build, and then she recognized the shoe pattern from the hoof prints she had found on the frost in October, the morning after she had locked herself in the chamber to test the ventilation. She had been trying to identify that horse for 3 weeks. She knew whose it was before Elias came through the barn opening behind her. She knew because the shoe pattern was the same, because the stride length matched the distance between the frozen impressions near the gate, because the conclusion that followed from these facts was the one she had not let herself arrive at in October, because she had not been certain. Elias came out and stopped 3 feet behind her. She heard his breathing change when he saw what she was looking at. He said nothing for a long time. His voice, when it came, carried the particular flatness of a man delivering a report on himself. "I came back in October, after I brought you the letter. I needed to know if you'd—" He stopped, started again. "The barn was dark, house was dark, no smoke. I rode the perimeter looking for you. I thought you'd left. Or—" He did not finish the sentence. "It was cold enough on the way home that the horse went down before I made the gate. I walked the rest." She had not known he had walked the rest. She looked at the bay horse for another moment. Then she looked at Elias Pruitt, who had ridden out in the night in October to check on a widow whose project he had twice tried to talk her out of, who had walked home in the dark when his horse couldn't continue, who had not mentioned this to anyone. She did not say she was sorry about the horse because he did not need her sympathy about the horse. She bent down, took a handful of the packed snow, let it compact in her palm, feeling its density. Then she straightened and walked back toward the barn to begin organizing the morning. By 10 in the morning, with the sun at a low angle, throwing long shadows across the sculpted drifts, all 17 people were outside. Ida moved slowly, supported on both sides, but she moved. Her color had improved through the night. Ruth's camphor and willow bark management had been the correct call, and the chamber's sustained warmth had done what the medical theory said it should. She would need rest and monitoring, but she was outside in the air, and her eyes tracked correctly, and she knew where she was. Lena carried the child against her chest inside her coat. His warmth generated partly by her body, her warmth generated partly by his. May walked beside them. 3 generations in a 10-foot radius on a Kansas morning that had no business containing them alive. And yet, Owen Garrett walked the perimeter of the barn with Wren, not because she had asked him, but because he was the kind of man who needed to be doing something useful when his emotions were too large for the available container. He had been in Kansas 3 months. He had built his homestead with enthusiasm that had not yet been tempered by the specific education the plains provided. His house had failed in the first serious test. He walked beside her without speaking, taking inventory of the drift heights, the structural condition of the barn's exterior, the state of the exposed fence lines, learning the damage assessment process by watching her do it. At the northwest corner, where the exterior earth berming met the north wall's foundation, she stopped. She pressed her palm against the barn's exterior north wall, feeling through the wood for temperature. It was cold on the surface. 2 feet behind that surface, separated by 3 feet of sod and earth, the chamber's north wall was warm. Owen watched her hand against the wall. He was working something out. She did not explain. He would either understand or he would ask, and either was fine. He understood. She could see it in the way he looked from her hand on the wall to the drift piled against the berm to the roofline and back, assembling the system in his mind. Seeing for the first time that the wall he was looking at was not a barrier between inside and outside, but a collaboration between the structure and the earth itself. He had thought about the barn as a thing built against the weather. He was now seeing it as a thing built with the ground beneath it. His voice carried the quality of a man who has just revised a foundational assumption. How long did it take you to work that out? 14 months to build, she said. The working out started with a question someone else wrote down. He nodded slowly, not asking for clarification, which was the right response. Some answers require the questioner to sit with them before the next question is possible. The assembly happened naturally without anyone organizing it. People simply came to stand in the yard because the yard was where the morning was, where the sun was making the top surfaces of the drifts sparkle in a way that was almost offensive after 43 hours of darkness, where the open air was its own kind of luxury despite the cold. Elias Pruitt moved to the center of the group. He had the bearing of a man who had spent 4 years moving to the center of groups when something needed to be said, and what needed to be said now was visible in his posture. Before he opened his mouth, the set of the shoulders, the slight squaring of the feet, the way he looked at each face briefly before settling his gaze on Wren. He spoke as though delivering a field assessment, which was the only mode he had for delivering something that required precision. I came to this woman's property twice in the past 14 months. The first time I told her the design was too complex. The second time I brought her a letter about a structure that had failed and told her she could be wrong. Both times I delivered my opinion with the confidence of a man who believed his experience was sufficient to evaluate what she was doing. He paused the pause of a man making sure the next words were exactly right. I evaluated her system against my experience. I should have evaluated my experience against her evidence. Those are not the same process, and I am old enough to have known the difference. I was wrong not about some parts of it, about the direction of it. She was right to build. She built it correctly. We are standing here because she did not take my advice. He was not finished. He looked at the barn at the earth berm visible along the north side's base. A quartermaster learns one thing above everything else. The supply line you build before the battle is the only supply line you have during it. There is no adequate improvisation under fire. There is only the preparation you made or didn't make. He looked at Wren again. She knew this. I did not credit her for knowing it. The statement landed in the cold air with the weight of something that had been paid for. Not an apology in the ordinary sense, an accounting rendered by a man who understood that accountability, without specificity, was just noise. May Kowalski waited until Elias had finished. She did not move from her position beside Lena. When she spoke, her voice had the quality of a woman who has chosen her words carefully, not for rhetoric, but for accuracy. I told her that people died in enclosed spaces from the darkness as much as the cold. I told her this as though it were a warning she had not considered. She had considered it. The slot in the interior wall, the lamp positions, the lamp she gave that child to watch. These were answers to the question I raised. She corrected for my concern without telling me she'd corrected for it. She looked at Tommy standing beside his father with his hands in his pockets. I came back to look at what she'd changed. I did not tell her I came back. I should have. I should have said that she'd answered the question correctly. Cal Maddox said nothing. He crossed the space between himself and Wren in 4 steps, met her eyes, directly held them for a moment, then nodded once with the deliberate full head movement of a man who means the gesture to carry everything the words would have said. She accepted it. She did not make a speech in return. She said the thing that seemed most true. You each told me something I used. Elias's questions about the flue dependencies, I checked the joist load differently because of that. May's concern about the dark that slot in the wall came from what she said. Cal's point about systems that can't fail safely, that's why I spent 2 extra weeks on the ventilation before I was satisfied. She looked at the group without performance. I didn't build this alone. I built it without help, which is a different thing. The distinctions settled over the group with the quietness of something accurate. The naming happened in the early afternoon when the sun had reached its low maximum and the air had warmed to something that could be described as merely brutal rather than lethal. Lena was sitting against the south face of the barn in the thin winter sunlight, the child awake against her chest, his eyes unfocused in the way of a newborn assessing the concept of light for the first time. May stood beside her daughter-in-law. She had been building toward this for several hours. Her voice when she arrived at it was direct in the way of women who had learned that directness was the form of respect. His name is Ren. She looked at her daughter-in-law, who nodded. She looked at the child. Not because you saved him, because you built the place where he could be born before you knew he'd need it. A person who does that earns the right to be remembered by a living thing. Ren looked at the child. He was very small. He was looking in the direction of the light with the concentrated effort of someone working out how vision functioned. He had no idea what had been required to put him in this particular shaft of sunlight on this particular morning. No understanding of the 14 months of planning in the 43 hours of execution that had preceded his first breath in the world. That was as it should be. The point of preparation was that the people who benefited from it should never have to know how close the other outcome had been. Ruth Alderman left in the early afternoon 2 miles north on foot because the road would not be passable for wagons for several days. She checked her wrapped hand one more time, decided it was managing, and put her coat on with the businesslike movement of a woman who had a property to check on. At the barn door, she said to Wren with the economy of someone who never used two words when one would carry the weight, Donal would have been satisfied. Then she walked north into the white landscape and Wren watched her until she was a dark shape against the drifts, then a smaller dark shape, then nothing. The sentence stayed with her in the specific way that accurate things stay, not repeating, but present the way a well-placed tool is present on a workbench, available without demanding attention. The inspection came in April when the mud roads had dried enough for an official vehicle to make the transit from Topeka to Ford County without losing a wheel. Arthur Pemberton arrived with a surveying kit, a measuring tape, a notebook newer than anything Wren owned, and the particular professional skepticism of a trained engineer who had been sent to assess what he had been told was folk engineering. He was methodical. He spent the first day measuring the chamber's exterior dimensions, the depth of the earth berming the height of the sod wall, the thickness at 3 points across the north face. He spent the second day measuring the interior, checking the ceiling joist dimensions against the load they were carrying, testing the ventilation function with instruments more precise than Wren's candles. He spent the third morning checking the flue junction, the stove's draw efficiency, the thermal differential between the chamber interior and the barn's main space at a measured external temperature of 41 degrees Fahrenheit. On the third afternoon, he sat at Wren's kitchen table with his notebook open and delivered his findings with the tone of a man arriving at conclusions he had not expected to reach. The earth berming provides insulation equivalent to approximately R45 by current standards. The thermal mass of the surrounding earth stores approximately 38,000 British thermal units per degree of temperature change. The ventilation system moves air at the rate modern building codes recommend for occupied spaces of this volume. The flue position is correct. I can confirm that the Nebraska failure was the result of a different flue position that created the carbon monoxide condition. He paused. Mrs. Calloway, I came here expecting to document a well-intentioned approximation. What you have built is a correct solution. The thermal performance exceeds standard structures by my estimate of 340% in heat retention. I would like your permission to include the detailed specifications in the State Agricultural Extension Report. She gave her permission. She asked that the report note the root source of the design principle, the Earth Lodge tradition that plain settlers had applied to homestead building for decades before she incorporated it. She did not want credit for the principle. The principle was older than she was. Pemberton wrote this down. He was the kind of engineer who recorded what he was told when what he was told was accurate. His report was filed in Topeka in June of 1883. The specifications it contained for earth berming, depth sod wall thickness, flue position, ventilation placement, were distributed to agricultural extension offices across Kansas, under the designation he used in his official documentation. Callaway Method, Earth-Bermed Shelter Construction, Ford County, 1882. She heard about the designation from Josiah Reed, who heard about it from a man who had read it in the extension office in Dodge City. She thought about Donal's penciled question on the margin of a 3-year-old newspaper and considered whether the designation was accurate and decided it was close enough. By the following autumn, 11 families in Ford County had built earth chambers using her specifications, each one adapted to local conditions, local materials, local geography. Owen Garrett built his that summer, working with Cal Maddox on the excavation using limestone he found under the surface of his claim. His came out well. He sent her a note describing it, the temperature differential he had measured, the adjustments he had made, asking one technical question about ventilation placement on a site with a different wind exposure than hers. She answered the question with a sketch and sent it back. She received, in the 18 months following the storm, 43 letters from homesteaders across Kansas into Nebraska, into the Colorado Territory, asking about the method. She answered every one. She drew the same cross-section diagram 37 times, adapting the dimensions each time to the conditions described in the letter, explaining the core principle in the plainest language she had. The earth is not something you build against. It is something you build with. The chamber served the Callaway property for the remaining years of Wren's tenure on it, which was the rest of her life. She did not rebuild it. She maintained it, annual inspection of the sod walls for moisture damage, annual check of the joists and ceiling load, the fuel supply replenished every September, regardless of the winter's predicted severity. She treated maintenance as a discipline rather than a response to need. The way you kept a good tool sharp, not because it was currently dull, but because the moment you needed a sharp edge was not the moment to discover the edge was gone. She never married again. This was not a wound she was tending or a commitment she was keeping. It was simply that the life she had built, the property, the work, the particular kind of self-sufficiency that came from being the only person responsible for a decision and its consequences, was the life that suited her. She had good neighbors. She had Ruth Alderman 2 miles north for the rest of Ruth's life, and when Ruth died in 1901, Wren attended the burial and stood at the grave in the manner of a person losing the last member of a specific company. Tommy Garrett grew up on the homestead. His father rebuilt that spring, better than the first version, because Owen had now been educated by the gap between what he had built and what the winter required. Tommy was 7 when the second version was complete, old enough to remember both versions, old enough to understand that the difference between them was a single winter's lesson paid in full. He became a builder when he grew up, a man who worked in Fort Dodge, then in Wichita, designing structures with the specific attention to thermal performance and structural redundancy that he had absorbed from watching his father rebuild and from 4 years living in range of Wren Callaway's example. In January of 1936, in a blizzard that killed 47 people across South Dakota and Nebraska, a family named Harmon sheltered 9 people in the earth chamber beneath what had by then become the Harmon barn, which had been the Callaway barn, which had been the barn she built her chamber into in the summer of 1881. The Harmons had used the chamber continuously since purchasing the property in 1907. They had added electric lighting in 1924. They had not changed the walls, the floor, the ventilation, the ceiling load, the flue position. They did not know precisely why the design worked as well as it did. They knew it worked. They went in again. All 9 people survived 31 hours at 38 below zero. The barn was torn down in 1957. The chamber was documented before demolition by students from the State University who had read about it in a historical survey and arrived with surveying equipment and the specific enthusiasm of people discovering that a thing described in documents was also a thing that could be stood inside and touched. Their drawings are housed in the State Historical Society in Topeka, filed under Agricultural History, cross-referenced under Materials, Science, Structural Engineering, and Thermal Design. The stone floor Wren had laid in 1881 is visible in the photographs taken before demolition. The natural limestone she had incorporated when she could not dig through it, the adjustment she had made when the plan met the actual ground, lasted 76 years under continuous use and was still sound when the bulldozer arrived. Wren Callaway died in March of 1921 at age 75 in the farmhouse she had maintained alone since Donald's death 41 years earlier. She had been ill for 2 weeks with the pneumonia that the winter of 1920 distributed across Kansas with the thoroughness of a hard season. She was conscious for most of it. She was not afraid. She had spent 40 years preparing for things she hoped would never happen, which left her with nothing in particular to regret about the ones that did. When her niece came from Wichita to settle the property, she found the farmhouse organized with the thoroughness of a woman who had known she was not coming back and had arranged accordingly. The kitchen was stocked for winter. The barn's maintenance log was current through February. The chamber door was properly latched. The stove damper closed the ventilation panels in the open position, the configuration for an unoccupied chamber being kept in ready condition. On the workbench in the barn in its corner was the toolbox with the leather straps. Left latch, right latch, center pin. Inside, among the chisels and the draw knife, was the Nebraska Farmer March, 1879. Folded oil stain, the fold lines darkened with decades of handling. The niece opened it to the page that was marked by Hughes, the one that fell open naturally, the one with the article about Earth Lodge building on the plains. She read the 6 words in pencil in the margin. W, can this actually be done? She read the 2 words in a different hand below, smaller, more deliberate, added in a moment that had happened 40 years after the question was written. Yes, done. The niece sat on a bucket in the barn for a long time holding the paper. She donated the box and its contents to the Ford County Historical Library in Dodge City, where they were cataloged and shelved. They are still there. The paper has been transferred to an acid-free sleeve to prevent further deterioration. The pencil marks are still legible, the question in one hand, the answer in the other, separated by however many years it took to know.